Okay. All right. Okay, we've got you. Good. Vincent, hello. Okay, so as we start playing here, for the folks at home who haven't seen Flower yet, it's on the PlayStation Network. Could you just give a brief description of what it is and what your role in the creation of Flower was?
Okay, so Flower is it's a PlayStation 3 PlayStation Network game made by Thatgamecompany. It was the second game that they made for a PlayStation Network, and it's sort of a Zen game. It's been described in all sorts of ways, but it's kind of a Zen game, a meditative game. You play as the wind, guiding these flower petals to various places, and these spaces which are essentially the dreams of these flowers on the windowsill that you actually saw just there. And these flowers are dreaming different things. So this first level is this space here, and then later on you'll see some different spaces, some that are a little bit more intense than others, some that have some different subjects to them, but throughout you're just...
Hold on, we just killed the game, Xander.
Shouldn't have done that. You shouldn't have done that.
Oh my goodness, way to break the flow, Xander. Alright, you can keep going, Vincent. Sorry about that.
Okay. Yeah, no problem.
More like Zender.
So yeah,
Okay.
throughout these different spaces, and there really isn't any way to lose the game. You just, and it's really very simple in terms of the actual game mechanics. You're just flying to different flowers and then growing your swarm of flower petals. And as you fly, you unlock different spaces, you find different locales, and eventually you make it all the way to the very end, which is a city, actually. And in the city, there's a little bit more conflict there, in a sense of, now we've got this sort of nature versus man thing going on. But for the most part, this game really doesn't have a lot of conflict. It doesn't have the traditional enemies or traditional objectives that a lot of other video games have. Yeah.
Okay, that was, so let's see, you were the composer for the entire game, is that right?
Yes. Yeah, so I was the music composer for the game, and Genova actually was really hopeful that I would get this job because we had actually worked together on a previous game called Cloud, which was done before Thatgamecompany was signed on with Sony to do their 3-game deal. So a lot of the guys that worked on Cloud were part of Thatgamecompany, and worked on both Flow and Flower, and Journey also, which is the game that came out just this year. Mm-hmm. But I was the music composer on Cloud, and I was able to get the contract with Sony to do the music for this game. And I actually had I guess business-wise, a traditional music contractor-publisher relationship with Sony, not necessarily with Thatgamecompany. But I also knew while I was working on this that I wanted to do a little bit more with the music, so I was working very directly with Thatgamecompany while this game was in production.
So when you got contracted to start work on this game, what about it really inspired you when you were composing for it?
Well, I really liked the concept. When I first got in on the game, it was actually extremely early on. There were just a few little prototypes for the game that actually weren't anything like the current game that's on PlayStation 3. It was extremely early on, and they wanted me actually to provide not just flavor, but also some inspiration as well, while these prototypes were being developed towards their eventual PlayStation 3 destination. So yeah, it was a very different place to be in as a music composer. Usually you get brought on pretty late into the game where, we already know that this is a game about flying. Well, actually, when I was brought on, we did it really know that Flower was going to be about flying and the wind swooping these petals all around. That's how early I was brought in.
So there are 6, if I remember correctly, 6 levels in Flower. And so you had to kind of create 6 different moods depending on the level. Which was your favorite level to compose for?
Wow. Well, it's interesting that you mentioned 6 levels, because I guess there are technically 5 levels and a 6th credits level. I happen to really love the 6th credits level,
Okay.
the 6th level, the credits level, because it actually does some different things with the interaction that are not used anywhere else in the game. So it actually has a little bit of branching going on, and if you linger in different spaces in the credits level, you'll find that there are some different loops happening, and it was actually really fun to work in a slightly different way compared to how I worked in the other levels. And actually, this is kind of a thing that kept on going through the game. When I started working on level 2, the interaction of between the player and the music was slightly different between the interaction between the player and the music in level 1. And then we kept on upping it with each level. So, yeah, level 6 I really like because it's so different from everything else. But besides that, yeah, level 5. Yeah, level 6 and level 5. I really am happy with how the music came out in those 2 levels.
I hope we can get that far in the game here, because yes, the music does really get a lot more complex and interesting as the game progresses. So I'm sure that you wrote a lot of music and, possibly changed a lot of it from its early form. Were there any pieces that you got pretty far on that just didn't make it into the game for whatever reason?
Yeah, there were actually a lot. I was actually looking back at some of the music that I had archived. I think there are 17 different tracks that are game ready. They're absolutely game ready. They have all the interactions set up as well. But we didn't. We decided not to go with those tracks, and there's a part of me that really wishes that music would see the light of day in some format. But it's also so weird to just put it out there as an MP3. It really was designed specifically for Flower and the way that the player could interact with the music. So maybe they're just going to stay locked up. I don't know.
As a huge fan of this game, Flower fan. I really and the music and the aesthetics of the game. I really hope that. I mean, I totally know where you're coming from. I would love to hear those in MP3 format or otherwise. That would be fantastic. But I definitely understand that. There's a component and there's an interactive component to composing for that game. So if you feel like that's the best solution, then it might have to be that way.
Well, I would like to put it out some way. I know actually this winter I'm going to go to a convention on the East Coast called MagFest, and I think part of this little panel that I've got planned there, I want to actually show some of these really early tracks that didn't quite make it into the game. That should be kind of fun.
I might have to get out there and see it.
It's a really good convention. It's one of my favorites.
We're talking about Flower primarily here, but you've also composed for some other games. Do you want to talk briefly about those games and how your work in there may be related to your work in Flower?
Oh, man. Well, I mentioned Cloud earlier, and Cloud shared some similar things in terms of aesthetics. Man, Cloud just came out so early on. I look back on some of that music and I think, wow, I was so naive at that time, so immature. But there were actually a lot of things there that I continue to do in Flower. So not necessarily the interactive stuff, but just the basic orchestration tendencies that I have were definitely established in Cloud. So my predilection for English horn and flute and oboe and other wind instruments like a bass clarinet, I use that a lot in places in Flower, but I also really started to enjoy using them in Cloud. But there are also a lot of other games I worked on which really didn't have this similar aesthetic. There was a Castlevania game that I actually worked on while I was doing a lot of stuff for Konami Mobile. And there were a couple tracks in there that I think are really cool, and I actually toyed around with putting them in Flower, and was manipulating them just for the sake of trying out this interactive system stuff that we were playing around with in the game. And it really didn't fit, but it was also kind of fun during some of the more action-packed things, like level 3, where you're going through these big wind canyons. It kind of fit there, but yeah, that stuff really didn't fit.
How different is composing for an interactive game where the music, where the playing of the music is based on the user's actions versus just where you need good, well-composed background music? Because you've also got the timing is kind of influenced by the player's actions as they play this.
Right. It's so hugely different. There's so much more iteration time that has to go into interactive music. Well, especially the way I work, which is really parallel to the production of the game. So these guys are messing with the levels, and because the level has been stretched out a little bit, or because there are now different events there, I'll need to change some things in the music, and then they might listen to it and say, oh, that's actually really cool, so we're going to change it this way, and then it almost creates this sort of feed-forward loop. And it can be a little bit difficult to rein that in sometimes, but it's also really exciting to have that back and forth happening, where it's music, level design, music, level design, music. So it really does take a lot more effort, a lot more time. But there are pieces there where the music really does hit a particular flavor, or there's a particular melody there that the game designers think, yeah, that is the sound that we really want to have. And then they decide, okay, we're going to make the level totally for this music. And that's happened a couple of times. It happened just a few times in Flower. But when that happens, it actually does feel pretty darn cool when the game designers are like, yeah, we totally see where you're coming from with the game design just because of the music that you wrote.
So, aside from Flower, what is your favorite video game soundtrack? I'm letting you exempt yourself from anything that you've
Flower
done.
is not my favorite video game soundtrack.
Oh.
I think it's cool. I mean, I really am happy with how the Flower soundtrack came out, but obviously it's me, so I don't listen to myself recreationally. Radiant Silvergun, first of all, is my number one. Is it my number one? Okay, yeah, Radiant Silvergun and Vagrant Story, which are two soundtracks by Hitoshi Sakimoto. Radiant Silvergun is actually a more traditional soundtrack in the sense that it's a very simple game with, well, it's not a simple game, but it's a shoot 'em up game, and there are basic loops that accompany all these levels. But even with that, without being an interactive score, it has a great sense of what the player is doing at any given time. It's not just a throbbing beat to go with all this manic action that's going on. The action in Radiant Silvergun is really quite nuanced, and I really enjoy how nuanced and how complex the orchestral score for Radiant Silvergun is, and it pairs incredibly well. But besides that, there's also Vagrant Story, which was Sakimoto's score to the dungeon crawler from Square back in 2000 or so. Really fantastic game, but even beyond the great soundtrack, it has one of my favorite interactive music scores because of the beginning of the game. The first 10-15 minutes of the game are totally interactive in terms of the music score, and it fits absolutely perfectly. The music never stops, but the player is always in control of what's going on, and the player might go slowly, might go quickly, and the music is always perfect there. I actually had a an opportunity to talk with Hitoshi Sakimoto about this, and he said he could do it because at the time he was working for Square. And that really got me thinking, yeah, this is really the only way to do really awesome interactive stuff. It's to do it in-house as part of the company and not just as a music contractor.
So more on music and interaction, do you enjoy either playing or sort of on an intellectual level rhythm or music games like Rez or Sound Shapes?
I love those games. So Sound Shapes just came out. I really enjoyed it. Earlier in the year, I had a chance to play around with some early builds of Sound Shapes, and I love designing levels, and it was incredibly fun. I think Sound Shapes is great. Rez is, man, for a while that was one of my very favorite games of all time. Well, it's still one of my very favorite games of all time. I love level 1. I love level 5. I think it's, yeah, I mean, Adam Freeland is great, but I don't think anything is quite as good as level 5 and that setting of his Fear track. It's really fantastic. Yeah, Rez is absolutely brilliant. Child of Eden is pretty darn good too. Sound Shapes, I think is absolutely wonderful, and I would love to see more games like Sound Shapes where it's not just sound and interactive music. The music and the level design have a one-to-one relationship. I think that's a really amazing, cool thing, and I'd love to see more guys pick up on that.
Do you prefer when you're composing to work on like larger games with a larger scope, or a little bit smaller games where you feel like you've got a little bit more room to work?
I'm not sure if that really works that way, actually. I think a lot of larger games, you're kind of set as to what is really being asked of the music composer. So you might have a scene, and the scene, lasts about 30 minutes of gameplay. And, and the expectation is that it's going to be scored in a specific way. So you just go and do that. You write a piece of music and it fits on that level of half an hour. But a lot of smaller games, the presentation to the player and the execution of game mechanics are not thought of in these 30-minute chunks or 1-hour chunks. They're thought on the level of seconds, or maybe 10 seconds, 20-second windows, and then suddenly things change. And I think that's actually really exciting that we're seeing a lot more of these smaller games, and now there are different sounds that have to happen on a totally different level than before.
We've got a question from the chat here, going back to musical interactivity. They'd like to know what you think of Phantasy Star Online 2's sympathy system. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it.
Oh, I'm sorry. I really am not familiar with that. I played a little bit of PSO on Dreamcast, but I don't know enough about PSO2. So I apologize. I should check that out then.
Okay, so we've got, I think, one last prepared question for you here before we're going to open it totally up to the chat. What's your favorite musical scale?
What? My favorite musical scale? That really depends.
I didn't write the question, man. I just read them.
Yeah, there are two favorite scales of mine. The first is D major. I really love D major. It has a lot of power to it, but depending on my mood, I would go either for D major or for G flat major. I really like G flat major. Not a lot of guys use it, but it's got a really wonderful tone. And honestly, I should use that scale more. I have been using that scale more in this latest game that I've been working on.
No minor scales? You're into you've got the consonants thing going?
Just listen to
No, I love minor scales, actually.
Well, you don't want to limit yourself.
Yeah, I mean, I like F sharp minor. I like B flat minor a lot. But
No.
And actually, when I'm improvising, when I'm just sort of jamming on the piano, usually the first thing that comes to mind is something in minor or something in blues. But my favorite scales are really major.
Okay, so while the chat's thinking up really intelligent questions to ask you, I've got kind of a weird one about Flower. So it seems you scored the levels interactively, but somewhat separate from that, you've got all these different flowers, and they kind of work a little bit separately. Can you just talk a little bit about how that worked out for you?
That was actually really hard. So the flowers have a little bit of intelligence there, where they're trying to make very specific melody lines. So when you go to a group of flowers, depending on the color, it knows, oh, I'm starting a new melody, and that melody is going to be so many notes long. And then for all of these flowers, the player is going to hear this particular melody, which is actually created on the spot with each playthrough. Oh. So if you play level 1, the white flowers, if you go through them in sequence, they'll play a certain melody. But if you play level 1 again, it will do another melody. And if you play level 1 again, it will do yet another melody. So there's a lot of interesting stuff going on there in terms of scripting and pseudo-intelligence and stuff. The idea being that the flowers would be almost like this guy who's jazzing on top of the music that's currently playing. And sometimes it would be really surprising, actually, some of the things that would come out of there. You would sometimes actually hear melodies that are, really simple melodies that are from other songs. So you could go through a level in one of the earlier versions of Flower, and you might hear Happy Birthday, or one time I was actually playtesting this at Sony, and for some reason in level 2, the flowers insisted on playing the theme to Close Encounters of the Third Kind. And that was just weird. And that makes sense. I mean, it's a really simple 5-note melody, and none of the notes repeat, and that was what was done for the yellow flowers that were in the section between part 2 and part 3 of level 2. So during this section, there's suddenly no music playing, and you're flying around, and they're doing the theme to Close Encounters of a Third Kind. And it was really, really ridiculous. Everyone in the office laughed.
And that's the aliens talking to you.
Yes, the aliens were talking to me there. It's amazing what a little code does.
Okay, so we've got a question from the chat for you here. From PSO2, what would you like to see in the future regarding audio in video games? Exploration of the medium or raising the bar on the standards for audio in games?
I think that there's a lot of space to explore. There's been a lot of stuff when it comes to procedural graphics creation over the last few years. Partly for the coolness factor, partly for space savings. And I'd like to see an effort similar to that being devoted towards music, not just interactive music, but things like procedural music creation, and not just music, but procedural sound design. Things like, looking at graphics and looking at models and textures, and then figuring out what would be the sound of an impact based on this model intersecting with another model. I think there's a lot of space left in interactive audio and interactive music to explore.
So I'm curious now. You worked on Flower, and you worked on some other games. What do you, if you're allowed to tell us, and we've had some developers be a little tight-lipped about this, what are you working on right now?
Oh man, yeah, I really can't talk about that right now.
It always happens this way.
We're just
it is a secret. It is a really cool secret. So, since
that's even worse.
Nowadays I'm actually working at that game company. When I was working on Flower, I was just a music contractor, but now I'm actually the audio director at that game company. So I'm there, every day, hanging out with the designers and producers and stuff. And we're making this game, and it will be cool. It will be very cool.
Well, I've been a fan of all of Thatgamecompany stuff, so I'm excited to see and hear it. Let's see. Research6 asks, how many instruments can you play?
Okay, if it's at how many instruments I can play well, that's 2. I'm a pretty good pianist, and I'm decent on the drums. And when I was in high school, I was forced to play some wind instruments because they didn't have a band that needed a pianist. So I tried my hand at things like clarinet and stuff, and I honestly wasn't very good at that. But then the next year, they had a jazz band, and I could join that. So, yeah, I'm pretty decent at piano, pretty decent.
So you come from a kind of an interesting angle into the independent and the video games industry in general. A lot of people are looking to break into the industry as designers. What would what sort of advice or tips would you give to people who are interested in going in as musicians, composers, or anything else in that field?
Well, I think it's really important to engage a lot of people, regardless of your status, whether you're a student or you're a guy in QA, or you're even younger than that, you're just a kid who has some ideas. I think it's really important to be willing to engage with people. So right after Greg got off, when you were talking about Bastion, he said that I should probably mention that we were actually on a news group together, and we were just hanging out on this news group, an email list actually for the Neo Geo, just talking about all sorts of stuff, deeply thinking about the games that we were playing, along with just talking stuff about the latest that was going on in the world. And it's really surprising, actually, looking back on that list, how many of those people who wanted to be in the video game industry got in. So obviously there's Greg, there's myself, there's a guy who is doing a lot of stuff with translating, and he's very well respected among the community in his involvement with the Ys series of games. There's another guy who's a producer at Sony. There's actually 2 guys from that list who are producers at Konami. I think just the fact that we were so engaged in what we were doing on not just a daily basis, but almost on a minute-to-minute, hour-to-hour basis, thinking really deeply about the stuff that we were doing, and also willing to disseminate that out to everyone for scrutiny, really helped us be prepared for what the games industry is all about, which is a really high-intensity industry that's constantly moving forward. So yeah, if you're just constantly engaged, regardless of where you're starting from, then you'll probably be okay.
Okay, so we're gonna do this credits level, since I know you like it, and we're gonna to sort of, as we're wrapping up the interview here. Let's see. Evil Badman in the chat asks, what other creative endeavors outside of music would you like to try your hand at?
Wow. Creative endeavors. One of these days, I'd like to learn how to properly draw. Because, quite honestly, I'm absolutely horrible at it. I make really bad stick figures. I do a lot of visual stuff already, so back in the day, I actually had a couple of jobs doing graphics design work, and I'm sometimes hired as a photographer, actually. But in terms of my actual drawing skill, I'm utter crap. I'm really, really bad at drawing. So if I could fix that somehow, if the time ever permits me to, I'll go for that.
From what I've heard, that's really what it takes, is, as with most things, practice.
Yeah. It's tough, though. Even when I'm not at work and thinking about the game, my brain's still thinking about the game. So it's tough to devote that time that's really so necessary.
Okay, so the last question before we have to go and continue on to other games comes from Virkung. He's interested if you've thought about a program that composes random music themes based on music theory. You were talking a little bit about sort of interactive melodies and things like that. have you considered just having a program that does that as its primary function?
Yeah, I think that's incredibly interesting. There's a couple of different games that I always cite and I always think about. Oh my God, how come I'm blanking on his name? Sid Meier. So Sid Meier actually back in the early 90s made a game for the 3DO called CPU Bach, and it actually wrote music in the style of Johann Sebastian Bach, and it wasn't bad. In terms of just making music, it was really darn good. Like, not as good as Bach, but certainly as good as many students who are learning to be music composers could do. And not too many people have pursued that path, because that was also around the time when people were thinking, we don't want synthesized music, we want really high quality music as Red Book audio on CDs. So that stuff didn't really get a lot of attention not too long after it was released, but I think that game, which is less a game and more this application, this interactive experience, is really awesome. And it wasn't just that game. There are other people that are not necessarily in the game space, but in the music composition world, that are using software to help them out in making music, and not just doing little things like melodies and stuff, but actually writing whole pieces of music based on existing music that's out there. It's pretty exciting, actually. I really am looking forward to that, because if a computer can make music that's absolutely gorgeous, cool. I'm a big fan of gorgeous music, or cool music, or awesome music, or really high intensity music, whatever. If a computer does it, or if it's a guy doing it, or if it's a guy who really knows how to use a lot of computers well, cool. I'm all for that.
Fantastic. Well, I guess this is it then. Thank you so much for being on. It's been a real pleasure. We are really, really glad that you could come on and offer us a sort of different and unique take on the industry. We have so many designers, as I'm sure you know, interviewing, so it was fantastic to have you come from a different angle and give us a little glimpse into what it's like to compose for games. So thank you again.
Oh, no, thank you. This was actually really fun, and it's been really cool actually watching the different games on stream. I was actually up late last night watching you guys play through Fez, so it's pretty cool.
Another fantastic soundtrack. So thank you for tuning in.
Another fantastic soundtrack.
We really hope to see you next year, and hopefully you'll be able to talk about your new projects and how that is going to work out for you in the coming months.
Oh yeah, definitely.
All right, Take care, Vincent. Thank you.
Thank you. You too.